We're a community of memory and of hope. And we had a service today remembering those that were important and were a long-time part of our lives and are gone. There are others
Really
who
gonna
are
have to keep me
important,
on.
long-time parts of our lives and are not gone.
You
We
worked
gather
hard.
today
You worked
to
hard.
remember and to hear, so that we may hold in our memory the story of Karen Schatzel and what her life has been with us and around us and through us, and in some cases in ways having nothing at all to do with us.
Thank you, Meredith, and thank you all for being here. This is a tough day for me, and one that I have great ambivalence about. First of all, I want to say that I'm going to need a lot of help from you, because last night I went to bed early thinking, oh yes, I have to be organized. I woke up at 1 o'clock and I was awake until 4:30. So I want you to know it wasn't anxiety about public speaking, because I did a lot of monitoring and of public meetings years ago and moderating, but I guess it was just the idea of coming together with you and sharing a lifetime that really doesn't have a lot of highlights. When Joe Majsak first approached me about this, after, well, it was even before Jim gave his Odyssey, I said, I don't have anything notable in my life. I have no great accomplishments. I haven't done any special things, and but Joe persuaded me that just for age alone, I've been around such a long time, and I've been in this congregation more than 50 years. So that in itself, that's a lot of staying power, a lot of ministers of education and so forth. But in any case, I said, okay, and through this whole process, I want you to give your complete sympathy to Joe, because he has been really a rock. In any case, I'm going to be using my notes, which I just showed to Joe, and he, well, shuddered, because especially after my night last night, my 85 years are catching up with me, and I'm not quite there yet, almost, but I'm on the cusp of 85. So there are a lot of things that I could teach you young folks about when it comes to aging, but it's only the aged who are going to want to listen anyway. So on the other hand, I will need a lot of help from Joe and from Meredith. So please be patient. Before I start, though, I want to share with you a quotation from a wonderful list of quotations that Liz Late sent to me. And Liz is, well, I hope she will be doing an Odyssey one of these days also. But the title of it was You Gotta Laugh, because all of these quotations were about old folks like us. But the one that I felt was most relevant today is this one, and it's from Mark Twain. The older I get, the more clearly I remember things that never happened. Now, I tell you that was the one I picked out that was most special, because thank goodness Joe is here, so he can tell you all the things that you should take with a grain of salt, because they might have come right out of imagination. So anyway, he is going to really be moderating this, and he's going to keep me honest, hopefully, and he's going to keep me in line. So I will now turn it over to Joe and see if I can find the notes that I have. Joe? Wait a minute, what? Who's doing what?
You're going to hold on to the mic. That's for you.
I know, but you're going to tell them how you're going to do this, right?
That's fine.
Okay.
The way we're going to work this is very simple. It'll be the same way we did it for the last Odyssey with Mr. Kopp. We'll have a 45-minute session where Karen walks us through the narrative for life's journey, and then we'll have a period of time for question and answer, and then we'll have coffee at Fellowship Hall afterwards. That's how we'll go through the day. And that's about it, Karen. So it's back to you to share your narrative with us.
Okay, and you will interrupt me, I hope.
I can do that.
As appropriate. All right, so when he interrupts me, please understand that this is agreed to between us. Also, one of the things I didn't say was that when I agreed to do this, since I don't have anything special in my life to share with you, I decided that I would base this primarily on historical facts and also trends, because as a woman in particular, I have been very much affected by the history in the times in which we've lived. And so I'm going to be going back to history all the time. And Joe broke this up into portions after many, many hours in the White Plains Library that we shared together. And he is going to break it up into particular segments. The first one was family. And one of the other things that I want to mention is that one thing that became very evident to me as we were talking is Joe is so much younger than I am that he's a generation removed. And even in our talks together, we recognized there were things that he didn't relate to that I was talking about. And when I have discussions with my son and grandchildren, this is very evident to me. Just the other night, my son and I had a discussion on the telephone about the fact that his 20-year-old, who Joe just referenced this morning because my 20-year-old grandson is a kicker on a football team for his college. And Joe had read about this, about what Ryan had done last week. So anyway, we were talking about that and the fact that Ryan, who's 20 years old, calls his dad to discuss things all the time. And my son Rob was laughing about the fact that when he was in college years ago, in the 50s, I mean, he lived in one of those, a true animal house, fraternity house. I mean, I think that film was based on his fraternity house because as far as I was concerned, it was a horror story from beginning to end. Anyway, he loved it. He has lifelong friends as a result, but he was not calling home all the time to check on what's appropriate in economics or whatever for class. So anyway, and when I was in college, we had one phone booth in the dormitory, and we would stand in line in order to call home. And in those days, long-distance calls were so expensive that we would call ahead and ask person to person for Joe Smith or whatever, and that was an indication to our family that they should call us back directly in the phone booth where they had the telephone number already, because it was so much cheaper. And we would talk just for a few minutes because telephone calls in those days were so expensive. But again, one phone booth in the dormitory, and you had to stand in line. And I see heads shaking from some people. Okay, so that's part of it. And also, I have a little gift card here from somebody in this congregation you know. Oh, the other thing I want to say is, please feel free while this is going on to go back and look at the memorabilia I've left on the tables, because there's so many things there that some of you will remember and some of you have never seen before. But these go back to the time when I first came here, which was in what did I say, 71? No, earlier than that.
50 years ago.
Thank you. Whatever it is. Anyway.
It's been a long time.
It has been a long time. But also, we're all affected by the times in which we live also. And I'm going to pass around this little card that it won't mean much to any of you, but it was a gift card from Sumi Kawiti, who was a beloved member of this congregation. And she died, about a year and a half ago, I think it was. And Sumi had grown up on the West Coast and gone to what she called an American concentration camp during World War II, because her family was Japanese American. And Sumi came out of that experience living there in this arid desert for years without any bitterness. She became a physician. She was a contributing member of society, and she was beloved to me. And the reason I want to pass this around is because it's obvious to me that this little gift card was something that she sent to me in October of 2011, before her death. She had made from a greeting card. This was a gift little enclosure. And I could tell that because it's obvious that she cut it out of another greeting card. And obviously she did that because her experience in that camp for those years taught her that you never waste anything. And you always use and reuse that which is useful. So she cut up a greeting card and made this little gift enclosure. And to me, that is a story in itself, because that was representative of her generation and everything that she believed in. And those of you who had parents or grandparents who went through the Depression knew that. So those of us, I shouldn't admit this in public, but I live alone, and when I have my yogurt in the morning, I still put my finger in and wipe out the bowl so that I don't waste it, because that was so ingrained in me that we did not waste anything, just as Sumi did not waste anything. So thank you. I will ask you. So going back to where I came from in all of this.
So now we're going to start the clock.
Okay. No, you should have started the clock
Again.
before.
Oh, no. Just so you know where we are.
All right.
That was the prelude that we didn't have in the program
and this
at
is
all.
What do we call this? Early life or my? All right.
The Fahrenholtz family early beginnings.
Okay. My parents were married in 1927, and they lived in the city of Cleveland at that time. And for some reason, I've never learned, they bought a house, even before they had children, distant from the city, so that we were at least an hour out of town from Cleveland, Ohio, which was not a big city to begin with. But it was a neighborhood that had been under construction. And in 1929, when the Depression hit, the builder of this property, who was holding the mortgage and the second mortgage on their house in those days, came to them and desperately needed money, and he said, you can buy out your second mortgage at half the amount because I need the money right away. So they both borrowed money, And they realized at that point, especially since my father's income had been cut in half already, they realized that they had to have some extra help. So they brought in a boarder or roomer who lived with us in our 3-bedroom house, 1.5 bathrooms. The half bathroom I've always thought is a joke because we called it a lavatory. And whenever somebody says to me about the lavatory, I'm going to the bathroom, I said, it's not a bathroom. Where can you take a bath? And so as far as I'm concerned, the restroom or whatever you want else to call it is not a bathroom. But anyway, where was I? I forgot. Oh, yes. All right. Back to my parents. Okay.
Right.
This is going to take a lot of coaching because, again, at my age, I am on the cusp.
The cusp.
Cusp of 85. And not only am I forgetting a lot of things, if I forget your name, please coach me, because that's part of aging. And we old people don't like to admit this, but we forget a lot of things, including people's names and facts, you know, like years and age, that things happened. And we do need some help. And if you see me closing my eyes in the service here, it's not because I'm going to sleep. It's because I have trouble concentrating and focusing. And I have to listen more intently, which means I have to close my eyes so that I don't have other stimuli. So that's part of the old folks syndrome also, for some people.
Maybe you can talk about the single-parent upbringing that you had.
Thank you. Thank you. As I said, my parents had been married in 1927. In 1930, my sister was born. And of course, that also added to the household, and it added to the financial burden. I don't know why, but of course, they waited 8 years until I was born in 1938. So my sister was already 8 years older than I. And unfortunately, this is one of the great regrets of my life. For circumstances that I'll explain, I never really got to know my sister in a deep way. And that was unfortunate. That is a loss in my life. And that's part of a ribbon that is up on the band there. But at that time, when I was 10 months old and my sister was 8, my father abandoned my mother and just left her flat with these 2 children and a house. And the shock of that caused her to lose her sight temporarily. Now, I don't know to what extent, but I was told she had lost her sight. Fortunately, there was this suburban or country doctor who was wise enough to know that this was psychological shock. And he told her that she would regain her sight. She would be all right. She would get on with her life, but she would be all right, and she would regain her sight. But that in itself contributed later to her becoming a Christian Scientist. And I mention that because we didn't have a car or anything, and we had to take 2 buses to go to the Christian Scientist church. And that sort of stayed with my mother all her life, to the extent that when I was approaching my senior year in high school, I had appendicitis. And my mother did not sort of acknowledge that. She was thinking it was just a severe stomachache or something or other. Fortunately, my Aunt Bess, who was 2 years younger than my mother and lived 12 houses up the street from us, went to my mother and said, "I'm bringing my doctor here." And so Dr. Friedman came and shipped me to the hospital right away, and I had an appendectomy that very night. But I mention that because as I said, my mother's Christian Science stayed with her, and I think until very late in her life. Now she went through the Methodist Church and the Baptist Church, and she finally had her last membership here in the Baptist Church here in White Plains. But in any case, that was part of her life because of the impact of that doctor and her near blindness. And in the early days of our life, I don't know how my mother managed or how she recovered, because of course that's history, and I was a baby, and I only know what others have told me about that time. But I know when she went back to work, she had to shovel coal in the furnace in the morning before she even left. And that was part of our household, because we had, at that point, a coal furnace. And when Joe and I were talking about this, he remembered also having a coal bin in his house. And he's so much younger than I, but that was also part of life. And we had a series of live-in housekeepers. And when I had told my 20-year-old grandson that we had a live-in housekeeper, he said, "Wow, you must have been rich." And I was so shocked, because I had always thought of us as being poor, that I didn't really think about the fact at that point that Social Security only started in 1935. And by the time we had these housekeepers, it was not really in effect. So women who did not have a background in any kind of training or were widowed without great resources often became housekeepers. And lots of people I knew had live-in housekeepers for that reason, because women needed work. And they would live with a family, take care of the children, do the washing. Our housekeepers never did the wash, because we had an old-fashioned wringer wash machine, so my mother did it at night. And I would be there, and I remember her reading me Lassie Go Home while we were waiting for the wash to go through 45 minutes or whatever it was in the wash tub. But in any case, that was my early life. And at some point, my aunt and uncle lived 12 houses down the same street. And as I said, my Aunt Bess was 2 years younger than my mother, and the two women were very strong women. I don't know how they ever worked things out between the two of them. They had very different approaches to life, but they supported each other throughout those years. And my Aunt Bess's husband, Uncle Joe, was like a father to me. And he was the only college-educated person in the family. Everybody else had been trained, the women as nurses or secretaries in my mother's generation, and the men all had to have some kind of mechanical background. She had 4 brothers. They also had 2 nieces who were raised in their family, because the mother of these 2 nieces had died in Spanish flu. That was part of the epidemic of that time. So they had to come and live with the family. So in any case, when I was about 4 and a half, I went to live with my Aunt Bess and Uncle Joe down the street so that they could supervise me going to kindergarten. And when I went to kindergarten, it was already World War II time, and things were very different for everybody, because men between 18 and 40 had all gone out to the army. There were no cars on the street because everything was rationed, especially gasoline. And my late daughter-in-law was horrified when I said that at age 5, when I went to kindergarten and was picked up by a school bus, I walked across the street by myself and waited with my companions for the kindergarten companions for the bus to come. because, I mean, there were no cars. In fact, we would stand at the bus stop waiting for the bus to come and say, oh, there's a car. And that's true, because there were no cars being manufactured during World War II, and nobody around, men, to drive them. So cars were very few and far between. Anyway, in all my years of public school, I never knew a single Asian, because in the first place, we were in Ohio. There were Asians on both coasts at that time, but also there were very severe laws, what do you call that, immigration laws, that prohibited Asians from coming to this country. So they were on both coasts, and but I never knew a single Asian through all of my 13 years of public school life in that community. And I only knew one child of color, and that was for a very short period of time when I was in the 2nd grade. And he was my best friend. And I mean, you know, among 2nd graders, he was my best friend. And all of a sudden he disappeared, and he didn't come. And every day I waited and waited on the playground for him, but he didn't come. And finally my mother, or my Aunt Bess, must have told me that his mother was probably a domestic for one of the rich families, none of whom sent their children to public school at that time. But she must have lost her job or whatever. In those days, we didn't even think about the family going south for the winter, or that they might have taken her, because we didn't do that. And people certainly did not go to Florida in the winter during wartime.
We need to move on to the college years.
Thank you. Thank
And
you.
I just want to clarify, help the audience understand that when you were with your uncle and your aunt, that you lived with them for 6 days of the week. Only on Saturday night did you
That's right.
take your belongings back and go back to your home with your mother and spend Saturday night and wake up on Sunday morning to go back to your aunt and uncle on Sunday night.
And that's right. And I would literally walk with my teddy bear down the 12 houses to my mother's home to spend that evening and Sunday with her. And even though my mother worked during the war, everybody worked 6 days a week. And that's why I never went home until Saturday evening. And at one point, I know she said they were even working 7 days a week in the office where she worked. But people got sick, of course, and they had to cut back to 6 days a week. So again, that's a part of history that we can't imagine in this day and age. But
Please talk about your college years.
yes, here, okay. It was always understood, even though my family was not educated, that I would go to college. And unfortunately, my sister only went for 1 year because she was ill-prepared. My sister never got over the abandonment of our father and the fact that we were different. Now, again, this is something you can't imagine, but divorce in those days was unheard of. I mean, my mother always felt it was a disgrace that she was divorced. And I felt stigmatized also. But anyway, I'm supposed to be moving on to college, which I did. And I selected Marietta College, which is on the Ohio and the convergence of the Ohio and Muskegon River. And it's a lovely, lovely old town that goes back to the American Revolution, and they have lots of historic sites there and so forth. And they even have a paddle wheelers that's still on the river, that if you go to Marietta, you can go there. And it was a very small liberal arts college. What made it different was that it was the first liberal arts degree in petroleum engineering. Now, I know that sounds weird to have a liberal arts degree in petroleum engineering, but most of the fellows I went to school with at Marietta College went on to very lucrative careers in the petroleum industry and are probably to this day still, I'll say, financing Marietta College. But it was something I really loved my college years. Fortunately, when I was in high school, one of the mothers had taught us to play bridge because she said you can't go to college and not play bridge. And so that was my entree to social life at the college. And I'm sorry to say I played a little bit too much bridge, but in any case, I was able to maintain my grades, and I had a half scholarship and so forth. And I was being prepared to be a teacher in home economics. Anybody who knows me knows, well, that's a joke. Because I've often said that if I turned my oven on, it would go into shock now. But in those days, home economics was the thing for women teachers in particular, because boys in school went to shop and girls went to home economics to learn how to sew and to cook. And the boys learned how to use different types of instruments and so forth. Excuse me. When I got to Marietta, I pledged a sorority because that was the thing to do. And my big sister in the sorority was the football queen, and she was gorgeous, and she was my buddy. And at some point, just before we were supposed to move on from our pledge status to full membership in the sorority, I decided that sorority life was not for me. I did not want to be in a sorority. It was not a matter of principle. I don't know why, but it wasn't for me. And I was shocked. Now, this is funny, but I was shocked that my big sister in the sorority dropped me like a hot potato, of course, because our relationship was based only on that Greek relationship. So anyway, through those years, I was very happy. And there were lots of Korean War veterans in the college at that time. And you could always tell the difference, not just the way they looked, but they were very focused because they had gone through a war experience in the Korean War. And they came back, and they were in college not to have fun and games, and as some of us were, but to really create a career for themselves. So there was a big, big difference in the veterans and the students that I knew for the most part.
Karen, speaking of fun and games, can you talk about your career with the radio station at your college? You lonesome gal?
Okay. I was active on campus. I belonged to the student union representing the independent students organization, so to speak. But I was also very active in the on-campus radio station, which in those days was still a big deal on the station. And one of the fellows who was a long-timer there, I was just a freshman at the time, but he liked my voice. So he created a program called The Lonesome Gal. And it was music and also poetry, everything he wrote or created for me or collected. But I was the lonesome gal, and it was supposed to be very secret, you know, and it was supposed to be a mystery. Well, of course, people caught on immediately. So the lonesome gal went into history, and I continued to work on the railroad, on the radio station, but that was not as the lonesome gal. But in any case, when I got to the point in later years that I had to do student teaching, by that time things had changed, and public schools were already switching so that boys would also take home ec, and girls would also have a chance to have shop. And it was a big move in society at that time. But here I was, a student teacher, with all these boys who absolutely did not want to be in home economics. They wanted nothing to do with cooking or anything sewing. Oh. And I was green as grass, and they knew I was an easy mark. And I was miserable, absolutely miserable. And fortunately, when I had finished my second year of college, my mother, who was much more practical than I, said, listen, it's about time that you learned to do a few more other things, because she must have known that I was not really dedicated to this teaching thing yet. But anyway, she insisted that I go to the evening college and go back to typing. I had had 3 years of typing. In fact, I have a picture of an old typewriter that I just received part of a campaign the other day. This was a mailing. This is about drinking water and infrastructure and so forth. And it says, obviously, you wouldn't use this for communication anymore. But I learned to type on a typewriter like that because everything was manual in those days. And so as part of my college life, I also went back and took typing and shorthand, which I absolutely despised. I don't know if you even know what that is, but it was a way of recording things in a different kind of script very quickly so that you could take minutes at a meeting. Well, I never got good at it, but in any case, I had schooling in it. So I thank my mother for her practicality, because in my later life, it was very important. While I was in college, I was pinned to a young man who came from a very privileged background. He had transferred from another college where I think he, as I recall, he flunked out or something or other. But anyway, his parents lived in New Jersey, and his father was what was then a governor in Rotary. Anyway, his parents were very social, and they went to these Rotary events all over the world because of his father's. So when I would visit in their home with him, and I, of course, stayed in the guest room, but the closet was full of all these beautiful clothes that his mother wore to all these special events. And I was so agog about this, and I noticed that all of the clothing that had not been worn yet still had labels from Lord and Taylor. So that alerted me to the fact that there was a store called Lord and Taylor. And the reason I mention that, because when I said something to his mother about all these beautiful clothes, and she said, always go to Lord and Taylor because their sales are the best anywhere. And even for somebody who bought gobs of really dress-up clothes, that was the thing. So Joe found it was very interesting that later on, when I was marrying, not that fellow, but my husband, I went to Lord and Taylor, of course, and the first dress I tried on was a pale pink, not shocking pink, pale pink cocktail dress with a jacket. And I bought the first dress that I put on for my marriage much later in life. But
So it's time to talk about you're entering the labor force. Are you ready to move on?
oh my gosh, all right. So obviously, I was not going to be a home economics teacher. And when I went, in the meantime, before I started my junior year in college, my mother had been working for what was then the New York Central Railroad. And during World War II, everything was shipped by rail, because we think of everything being shipped by trucks. But there were no trucking firms then, because in the first place it was gas and no drivers around. So everything during the World War II was shipped by train. And it's hard for people to imagine, but we didn't even have frozen foods to any great extent in those days. And I remember when Snowcrop was the first company that that marketed frozen fruits and vegetables and so forth. My family didn't buy them because they were too expensive, but everybody, particularly during World War II, had a victory garden, and whatever you bought, you canned. My Aunt Bess had hundreds, I say, of bottles of canned tomatoes, and that from the Victory Garden during the war. But in any case, my mother worked for the New York Central Railroad, and when she had been hired during wartime, they told her right off the bat that they were only hiring her as a woman for the time being, and as she would be out of a job as soon as the war was over because it would go back to a man. Well, of course, by the time the war was over, she was very proficient in what she did, and by that time also, rail travel and rail trafficking really started to decline because trucking came in and people were starting to travel in their own cars. So the railroad industry, which had been the top of the business company area, went way downhill. And in 1959, when I was a college, I was just going into my junior year of college, my mother was told that the New York Central Railroad office in Cleveland, which was in the Terminal Tower, which was the most prestigious building in downtown Cleveland. Oh, I forgot to say during that time also that I was an avid Cleveland Indians baseball fan because every time I was sick as a child, you too, I was sent to my grandparents' house because, of course, they had gone through every contagion, and when I had whooping cough, which children never have nowadays because they're inoculated for pertussis, but I had whooping cough in the 2nd grade and was with my grandparents for 7 weeks. And the only other person I knew that was my late daughter-in-law's mother, who's 9 years younger than I, and she had whooping cough in the 7th grade. So she was much more handicapped than I was, but it was being at home for all that period of time. And while I was there with my grandparents, I became this avid baseball fan, and I would listen on this big radio with my grandfather sitting on the floor next to him, and he was a Cleveland Indians fan, so I became a Cleveland Indians fan. And in 1947, after Jackie Robinson broke the color barrier, the first black in the American League was Larry Doby. And I remember hearing on the radio that they were booing Larry Doby on the Cleveland Indians baseball team. And I said to my grandpa, why are they booing him? He's on our team. And my grandfather said, because they're ignorant. And I didn't even know what ignorant meant at that point because I was so young. But I got the picture that was bad, that he was a good guy and he was on our team. And then the same president, Bill Veeck, brought in Satchel Paige, who was also a great pitcher in the Negro League, and he brought in Luke Easter and so forth and so on. And believe it or not, at age 10, and I'm sorry I have to go back to this because, again, this was a different age, I would take the bus at age 10 by myself from the suburb where we lived into downtown Cleveland, an hour bus drive, and when I knew that the team was coming in on the train to the Union Station in the Terminal Tower on the lower floors, because I wanted their autographs. And I would get up early in the morning. I only did this a couple times, obviously. But I took the bus in, and I waited, and in those days, the ball players traveled. They were wearing suits, ties, overcoat, hat. And when they got off the train, they all looked like they were going to business because that was life. And that's the way they traveled in those days. And they traveled, I suppose, by special train. Who knows? But in any case, the Cleveland Indians had more black players than any other team in the American League for a while because of that. And they were my team. So anyway, where I'm...
Would you like to talk about your first job and how much fun that was?
Oh, we're going back to my first job. All right. I graduated from college in the meantime.
I thought we'd go through them in order instead.
No, you're absolutely right. You're absolutely right. I graduated from college in 1960. And by that time, I think I was engaged to Doug, but I don't remember. Thank you. Thanks. As the old saying goes, God, I need all the help. God knows I need all the help I can get, right? Anyway, where was I when you interrupted me? My first job. Okay. By that time, I went back to the New York Central Railroad when I started my junior year in college. My mother's office closed. My mother was 59, and a woman at 59 in those days did not look for another job, especially if she was matronly looking, as my mother was at that age. And the reason I think that's so important as far as the history was concerned was because when my company later went into a merger and so forth, and I had the choice of either staying with one of the new companies or the subsidiaries at age 59, I wanted to move on in my life, and I had no qualms at 59. But it was a generation later. And so at 59, my mother's choice was either to look for another job or to move to New York, where the New York Central was consolidating their forces, and it was mostly down at Grand Central and the buildings just north of Grand Central, and she continued to work until she was 69. But in the meantime, she moved to White Plains. So at that point, I, of course, was still in college, but I technically moved to White Plains also. And that summer, I went to college because I was unfamiliar with New York and so forth, and I really had to make up some credits in science. So I went to NYU down at Washington Square for the summer, and someone wisely advised me that I should take my science credits in the education school rather than any of the other schools at NYU because it would be the easiest. And so I signed up for this, and it was a wonderful experience, and I know I'm off schedule, I apologize. But anyway, it was my introduction to New York City because I took the train in from White Plains every day. And we had a morning laboratory all morning, and we had an afternoon lecture series every afternoon. And I think this was for 6 weeks, I don't even remember. But there was only one other female in the class. She was a nun, and she was in full habit. In those days, nuns were still in full habit. She was darling, but she knew I was a know-nothing. And we had lunch together every day, and she taught me that I should drink Coke because of the caffeine with lunch to stay awake for the afternoon lecture. Didn't work. I still fell asleep. But in any case, because we were the only two females, she was preparing to move on in her life and to become a physical therapist, I think, or something or other. But she was a darling person. And it was my first experience with a Catholic nun. So it was the most positive experience I could have possibly had. In my family, Catholics were of suspicion, I'll say. And in the neighborhood where I had grown up, it was only Catholics and Protestants. I didn't know a single Jewish student, as I said, in my growing up years, until after World War too, and development of the suburbs began also. But again, no Asians and only one student of color in all my public school education. Anyway, going to NYU, as you can imagine, at Washington Square was an experience. And this nun used to walk me to the train every day because we had to go through Washington Square to get to the subway. And of course, it was a drug haven in those days. It was all druggies all over Washington Square. And she knew that I was clueless, that I was so innocent and so, well, lacking, not ignorant, that I wasn't safe. So she insisted upon walking. So again, my memory is failing, but I don't know how I discovered the Margaret Sanger Clinic in those days, because abortion was still illegal in New York, and the Margaret Sanger Clinic was located off of Fifth Avenue, and Margaret Sanger was one of the pioneers in the choice movement and for abortion. And again, I do not have any idea how I learned of this, but I became a volunteer. And I don't even know how I explained this to my colleague, the nun. But anyway, that was the beginning of my volunteer work of my own choosing. And all I did was go in and file papers in the office and that sort of thing. But I had an idea from that point forward what it meant for women having choice. And that was a turning point in my life. So I'm going back to where I graduated from college 2 years later. But anyway, my first job out of college was a disaster. I mean, a total disaster, because I really wasn't prepared to do anything except teach at that point, and I didn't want to teach. Fortunately, in White Plains, there was, at that point, AT&T had this tall tower in White Plains, which was one of the most prominent buildings. And I know you can't imagine this, but where the old Galleria is located now and vacant in White Plains, that was all tenement buildings. It was very old, dilapidated tenements, all those blocks, and they were all raised in order to build the Galleria. But White Plains was a totally different city in those days. And anyway, somebody suggested that I go to AT&T. And so I had a series of tests to see what I was capable of. And they gave me the wrong test. And they suggested that I become a programmer because I could also play chess by that time. And I played bridge and so forth. And nobody knew how to test anybody for programming of technical material. And AT&T didn't even have IBM equipment. But when I was trying to explain to somebody that I was hired as a programmer, I said, you know, for an IBM machine, because none of us knew what technology was about in those days. So I was hired to be a programmer for the Remington Rand equipment they had, and they were developing this big department for AT&T. So I spent the next 6 months going to workshops in Manhattan primarily for training in programming. Zilch. I mean, I was so out of my depth. But fortunately, I had a lot of friends from college, and I had friends, even from the time when I went to NYU, I had made some friends. So I loved going into Manhattan, having these classes where I was lost, but I still had a social life, and so I was learning about Manhattan at the same time. So after 6 months, I knew I was going to be found out. So I resigned, not out of pressure. They didn't realize I was as bad or as incompetent as I was, but I resigned. And my second job was my dream come true, my mother's nightmare. I worked for American Airlines in what was then the West Side Airline Terminal. In those days, there were 2 terminals in Manhattan. There was one on the east side, I think it was around Lexington someplace, and there was another one on 42nd and 10th Avenue. And people would take the bus from the West Side Terminal to go to Newark Airport, and from the East Side Terminal to go to LaGuardia, or what we called Idlewild at that point, the JFK now, airport. And I was a customer service person, and I loved it because the business people came in and there was a lot of camaraderie and so forth. And also they had skycaps there who took care of your luggage. And there was a great camaraderie also with the skycaps. So it was a fun and games kind of job. But then when they had to cut back on their telephone service, I had to go and work on the shift on the telephone. So I had to learn that for American Airlines. In the meantime, in those days, when business went down in different seasons, they would just furlough people, the airlines, and they didn't pay you when you were furloughed, but you had free travel. So all the employees could travel like mad, but didn't have any money to go anyplace. But in any case, I did do a certain amount of travel. But after I was there for a while, my mother said to me, "Your aunt and uncle and I did not sacrifice for you to go to college to have this kind of a job. Don't you think it's about time that you got a real job?" And I neglected to say that when I had to go on the phone service, I was on a 3 to 11 p.m. shift at night, and it was too late to get a train back to White Plains, so very often I had to stay at the YWCA, which was at Lexington Avenue, in a tiny little room with a tiny little sink and so forth. But it got expensive for me also, and I wasn't making any kind of money. But so anyway, my mother insisted that I start looking for another job. And I went to the New York State Employment Office at that point. And in those days, they had just established a new order so that they had all these separate offices for the employment service. So they had all the people in the garment industry in one office. They had all the people in restaurant industries in another office. And they had a professional office on Avenue, half a block down from St. Patrick's Cathedral, and where they had 3 floors. It was the Newsweek building. And so people from television and so forth were in and out all the time. Well, I got a job working for New York State Employment Service in the professional office. Here I was, again, 22 years old, knowing nothing, 23, whatever I was at that point. And, but it was such fun because of the location, and we'd go out for coffee every day to Chock full of Nuts, which was half a block down. And one day, at that point, who was the first black baseball player? Jackie Robinson. Jackie Robinson was a vice president of Chock full of Nuts. And he came in one morning, and I think my coffee break went on for 2 hours because I was so enthralled, because he was there overseeing operations and glad handing, customers and so forth and so on. But it was my time to meet Jackie Robinson, and he was a very impressive figure in any case. At the same time, there was a fellow working there. As I said, I think we had 3 floors, and he was placing people who were in the accounting field, professionals on all levels. And we had a bowling team in the evening, And I was a rotten bowler, but we had so much fun, that we would get together after we bowled and so forth, and people can't believe how different the city was in those days, because it was not dangerous or anything else. And again, I was right on Madison Avenue near St. Patrick's Cathedral, so it was a very choice neighborhood. And anyway, it was fun, and I started to room with 2 other young women in a 1-bedroom apartment, if you can imagine, 3 young women in a bedroom, three single beds, 3 dressers, and a living room. I mean, when I look back on it, but anyway, it was an experience, and it was a good learning experience about life in general. And I can't move on to marriage yet because I haven't even met my husband yet. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. I just, that's clarification. That's not criticism. Okay. But anyway, at that point, the fellow that I was, one thing I neglected to say, this fellow who I was pinned to in college, I was engaged to briefly, and we went at one point to his parents' favorite place locally, which was the Mohawk Mountain House. I don't know if any of you ever have been up there. Lovely old place on a beautiful setting. Anyway, and as quaint as it seems now, he and I had separate rooms and actually slept in our separate rooms, a long time ago. But anyway, that was part of life in those days also, at least for me. And where did I leave off before? Oh yes, at that point, this fellow Doug had been drafted because there was still the draft going on. And fortunately, when he got out of the service, he benefited from my disaster at AT&T. And I said, this is a perfect job for you. You should get into programming. And he did. But that was kind of a letdown for him because I was letting him off kind of easy because I didn't want to be engaged anymore. So, that was part of it. But anyway, we broke that off, and he was still in the service at that point. And from this bowling team, this young man was there also, and he found out that I was no longer attached and invited me out. And his name was Norman Schatzel. And we had our first date meeting under the clock at the Vanderbilt down at Grand Central, and we went to see the Fantastics, which was the show at that time, and it was off Broadway, and believe it or not, the circle in the square was so rustic in those days, they didn't even have regular theater seating. They had all these chairs in the off-Broadway theaters. It was different. But anyway, we went out to dinner, and we went to see the Fantastics, and it was love at first sight. I won't say love at first sight, but it was instant. And Norman was the love of my life, and we decided rather quickly that we were going to get married. And my mother was stunned and said, oh, well, you have to do something. But in the meantime, we were looking for an apartment so that we could, as soon as we were married, we could live in this apartment. And in those days, you had to look for an apartment through ads in the New York Times or whatever it was. Again, we didn't have any cell phones. We didn't have any information systems like that. It was either word of mouth or newspaper or something like that, or there were agencies, I'm sure. But in any case, before we were married, Norman had found an apartment in Elmhurst, Queens. And we looked at it. It was a nice, big apartment, and it of a block and a half from the subway going into Manhattan. So it seemed like the place to go. Anyway, so we decided we would take this apartment. And when we went out there, we drove out to Elmhurst. And Norman went in because in those days they never would have let two single people of the opposite sex sign a lease together until they were married, of course. So he signed the lease, and he came out, and he was jubilant. And I was sitting in the car, and I was crying. And he said, as I said, he was jubilant that we had found this apartment. He said, "What's the matter?" I said, "I don't want to live in Queens." I mean, to me, Manhattan was the only place to be, and I certainly did not want to live in Queens. But the lease was signed, but that was his introduction to life with the future Mrs. Schatzel. And it was probably a good warning and sign to him of what our life was going to be like, because we were direct opposites, and you know that old expression about opposites attracting and so forth and so on. And he was very reserved, very proper, very upright, and I was, anyway. So we moved into that apartment, and in the meantime, we were married in a chapel of Marble Collegiate Church, which is where my mother went. And I don't know if you've ever heard of the Reverend Norman Vincent Peale, but he was the minister of this big Marble Collegiate Church at that point, and we were very impressed because he was a major writer and so forth, and my mother thought he was wonderful and so forth. So we were married in the chapel in a very quiet ceremony, because Norman and I had a lot in common. When he had come back from serving in Korea, after it was in the middle of his college years, because he was drafted. There was still a draft in those days, and he served in Korea. He was 8 years older than I. And the night that he came home from Korea and came back to the U.S., he went into New York, and he went into someplace in Queens where his father had a Buick car agency, thinking that he would drive home to Bethpage, Long Island, with his father when his father was finished working. And his father did not tell him anything other than to give him a car to take so that he could drive himself to Bethpage first, presumably. When Norman arrived there, he learned that his father had left his mother as soon as Norman had gone off to Korea and on a troop ship, and he had married, sort of, in the meantime, and had 3.5 children, one on the way. So Norman and I shared a lot of, he understood what it meant, because in the months after that, when he learned from his mother what had occurred, he had to help her in her abandonment. But I must say that his mother was a very timid person. We had little in common. I loved her dearly, and she was a wonderful, wonderful mother-in-law. But she was a very timid person. Yet, in all the time he was in Korea, she wrote to him every other day. I mean, just about this little stuff of being a housewife and so forth, and she had a part-time job. But she wrote to him every other day in Korea so that he had mail and so forth, but she never told him about this abandonment. So he and I had that strong understanding and had much in common because of the fact that we both understood what abandonment meant and how it affected people's lives. In any case, Norman was stalwart, and he was the person who was always on top of everything, and sometimes reluctantly allowed me to do my own thing, but he was always the force in our marriage, and the person who was always responsible, always. And we had a very good, long marriage, but living in Queens, believe it or not, we, after this first rental, 2 years expired, we bought another co-op in Queens because we had a little money at that point and wanted to invest. But I had a miscarriage in the meantime, and when I learned that I was expecting for a second time, I was determined to leave Queens. So I went through the New York Times all the time and looking, because I was determined to live in Westchester because I knew more about Westchester at that point. And I did not want to live in Long Island either. So anyway, I found a place for sale in Irvington. It was a very modest co-op apartment. And we, after some shopping around, we bought a co-op in Irvington. And by that time, our son was 6 months old, and I was a stay-at-home mom, period. And it was an adjustment for me. And so I started to look around also for volunteer activities. And fortunately, I had lots of babysitting right in this co-op where I lived because there were a lot of elderly women and so forth. So I was able to my young son and help at a child care agency it's called Abbott House that had been formed in 1963 to keep sibling groups together, because in those days children there were in orphanages, and I don't even know if you know the term orphanage, but older people would know it. And Abbott House was set up to keep sibling groups together so that they weren't sent out to all these different orphanages if there was some need. And I started to help there in the nursery. And if you can imagine this, in those days, they had 3- and 4-year-olds living in a dormitory conditions in the Abbott House. And I went in thinking that I was going to read to these children as my son was read to in his nursery school and at home and so forth and so on. And I soon recognized that these little ones were not so much interested in hearing me read a story as they were in just being held on my lap and touching my face and feeling my hair and feeling the warmth of a human body. And that was my introduction to child care. And to this day, I'm still an emeritus board member at Abbott House. But through the years, fortunately, it has changed. And at this point, now, Abbott House is taking care of a lot of unaccompanied immigrant children who have been coming in over the last few years. And this was very hush-hush at the very beginning because it was politically sensitive. But anyway, that was my introduction to volunteer work in the suburbs. And then when my son was at a point where he went to school, I was always a volunteer in the kindergarten because the kindergarten was also a new thing, open classroom where they had kindergarten first and second and third grades together. So that was a change also in our society, open classroom situation. And then I was a volunteer in the library. And I have lots more stories about that also. But also during that time, I went back to school at night, and I took typing again, and because I knew that I could get a job part-time. And fortunately, I got a job with two lawyers in Terrytown. One was a Republican, one was a Democrat, so they could cover both areas. And they did all kinds of, house sales or whatever, but it was general law. And I was able to go in during the week and type from what a dictaphone is, I think it was called, yes. And because they would come in the evenings and work and leave things for me to do. And I was even able to take my toddler at that point, he was so little, and he would play under the desks, and one day they found a little toy under the desk, so they knew, and I said, yes, I bring my son in. But there were, we were alone, and I was able to work, and he would play by himself there in the office. And on Saturdays, my husband would take care of him, so I would work all day Saturday with the two of them. So that was my introduction to the working world. And
Do you think you can move forward and start talking about your CUC entered the picture?
the what?
CUC, the church entered your life at that point?
Yes, thank you. Thank you, thank you. The next chapter is this community. And when my son was 4 years old, I took him to a cooperative nursery school in Terrytown because the cooperative nursery school, the parents were expected to also participate and help in the nursery school, and we were on a schedule and so forth and so on. So that was his introduction to nursery school. In those days, there were very few places that took 4-year-olds and none that took 3-year-olds or younger. So that was another part of history. But I had learned, at that point I was reading a lot of novels, and I had read a novel by John Fowles that was called The French Lieutenant's Woman. I don't know if any of you have remembered, but John Fowles, that was a very popular novel in those days. And so I got another book from John Fowles, thinking I was going to get another great novel. And instead it was called, I think, The Aristos, or Aristos, I don't know. But anyway, it was philosophical, and I didn't realize at the time that John Fowles was not an agnostic. He was actually... not an agnostic, so he was atheist. Thank you. Anyway, and I was sitting reading this book, struggling to figure out why did I get this book when I thought I was getting a good novel. And I was reading it late at night, and all of a sudden it occurred to me that I didn't believe in God, which was a huge shock to me. And not something that I admitted to anybody because I knew my mother would be shattered if she knew this. But anyway, I thought, what do I do now? Because Norman and I had tried a number of churches in the area, and nothing seemed to work. Fortunately, there was another young mother of 2 children who lived nearby, and we were I guess in the laundry room or someplace, and she told me about what was then CUUC. It was just community Unitarian in those days. And so I thought, okay, I'll give it a try. So I made lots of telephone inquiries about bringing my 4-year-old at that point. And at the nursery, we had, I don't know how many of you remember Harry Moore. But Harry Moore's first wife, Betty, had been Miss Betty in Romper Room, which was a big deal on television. So she was here in our nursery, and she had the children here. And so I came and I investigated that, and I came very early on the first morning bringing my 4-year-old, and I stayed with him for about a half an hour to make sure that he was going to be okay in the nursery, and he seemed to be fine because by that time he was already going to another nursery school, so he was accustomed to be in that kind of a setting. So I came in And the minister at that time was Peter Samsom. And Peter was from the Netherlands. He was very upright. Everything had to be just so. I got to love Peter and visited him years ago when he was an interim minister. But he wanted everything to be just so. And Hans, who helps in our child care, Hans' father was the head of the ushers here at that time under Peter Samson, and Hans only had men ushers here, and they had to wear a suit and they had to wear a tie and so forth in those days to usher here in the church. And that's the way Peter wanted everything to be just so in our church. Anyway, I came that first Sunday, and I remember I was sitting over there, and all of a sudden in the middle of the service, Betty Baker, who was the RE director at that point, came in with this child wailing at the top of his lungs. And of course, it was my son, who had suddenly wakened to the fact that his mother wasn't there and he was in an unfamiliar setting. And she didn't know who his mother was, so she couldn't come along to find me, so she had to bring this miserable child who he was so overwhelmed by this experience. So of course I rushed out and I stayed with him there for the rest of the service because I think I was riding with my neighbor Betsy Reitbauer at that point. So we stayed the whole time, and of course I was so embarrassed. I thought, oh, I'll never come back here again. But fortunately at that point, there was also somebody here who was active in the same cooperative nursery school, and Rice.
She persuaded you to give it a second chance.
I'm trying to think. She was from Hackley. Yes. Nancy Rice. Thank you very much. Nancy Rice is the mother who was in this cooperative nursery school with me. Thank you. And her husband was also very active here. He was the principal of the underschool at the Hackley School in Terrytown. It's a private school up there. Anyway, she came to me right away, and she called me on the phone and she said, oh, you have to come back. It'll be fine. We'll work it out one way or another. Well, I don't remember how we worked it out, but I suspect it was because I finally left my son home with my husband, who wanted nothing to do with organized religion. He had had a bad experience as a Catholic, as a boy, and he wanted nothing to do with religion. So he was very happy to stay home on Sunday and read the New York Times and take care of his little one. So anyway, I think finally Rob came, my son, when he was a little older, and he came to the RE program for a while. But it was not a total success, I'll say. Anyway, by that time, I was helping, what did I say her name? Nancy Rice, thank you, in the kitchen for things. And also there was a cleaning. We had a once a month women's committee, women of course, here to wipe down the furniture and do little housekeeping things that the custodian, who was aging, did not do. Of course, it was all women who were here helping once a month. So I got acquainted with women here, and it was no time at all before I was asked to prepare the wine and cheese for the annual meeting of the congregation, which was a wine and cheese evening event at that point. And I was clueless how to do this. Fortunately, there was a wonderful man on the board who took me in hand and told me how much all is to buy and so forth. And he took care of all the ordering of the wine because he was a connoisseur and so forth. So anyway, I got through that first meeting, that first congregational meeting, and I wasn't even a member at that point yet. But of course, as always is the case with volunteers, I was invited immediately to be secretary of the Board of Trustees. And in those days, the secretary had to take the actual minutes because the church was so poor that in the summertime, we had no services here in the summertime, so the one person who worked in the office was furloughed, I'd say, in the summertime, and she collected unemployment insurance because the church was closed in the summertime. So that's how poor we were in those days. But in any case, I started to get acquainted with her also, and she was a longtime friend, and we remained friends for many years. But that was the beginning of my involvement. And as I mentioned, my fondness for Peter Sampson, I was also very involved I use the word involved, very friendly with the chair of the board at that point. And his name was Robert Clapp, and he and his wife were very active here, but fortunately he got retired just at the same time that Peter left. And that when Peter left this church, if you read this, and one of the things I should have said at the very beginning is, please get up and look at the things that are on the table. I should have said that, as I said from the beginning, because I know sitting so long and listening to somebody talk, and I would be very happy if you would get up and look at those things, because there's a lot of memorabilia there that I want people to look at, and photos and so forth. So please do look, and if then you have to be on your way, that's fine too. But please go up and look, because there's a real history there, including Peter Sampson's letter of regret when he left. And years later, when my son was looking at colleges, and we went to Northwestern, is that Skokie, Illinois, Northwestern? Where? Yes, thank you. Peter was the interim minister there, and I knew that. So after the interview we had on a Saturday at Northwestern, my son and husband stayed in the hotel, and I went to the church and spoke and had a lovely reunion with Peter and his wife. And it was a difficult parting for Peter because his wife had a lot of problems here. So that's as much as I want to say about that. But that was also the beginning of my life here. And through the years, I've been here through many interims. And at the time that Shannon Bernard was here, I think probably we're about out of time, aren't we? But,
we were out of time a long time.
okay.
If you want to think about how long ago this...
What time is it?
It's still Sunday, you're okay.
So it's still Sunday, thank goodness. Oh, all right, okay. Well, in any case, I did this again about 20 years ago, and at that time, I don't even remember what I said. As you can tell, I am really starting to lose it in lots of different ways. But Iraj has not forgotten a story I told, and I thought, well, it doesn't really fit in today, but I'll tell it to you anyway for a reason that was part of my earlier Odyssey. And it was about when I was driving one day in our family's dark green four-door Honda. And I was on my way home to Irvington, and I was in the outside lane because I was going to make a right turn. And while I was waiting for a traffic light to change, a motorcycle came roaring up on my left, and the driver had this lovely young woman sitting behind him. She had purple and white hand-tooled cowboy boots on, and a very short skirt, and red hair sticking out of her helmet. And the whole scene, she turned because there must have been a noise or something or other, and I just instinctively put my finger up, and she laughed so, and she turned the light was still red, obviously. And she told the fellow about this, and they both looked and laughed and so forth. And as soon as the light changed, they both waved and were on their way. And I was left sitting in my four-door forest green Honda, and they were off in the world. And all I could think of was, my body is trapped in this Honda, and my spirit is out there in purple boots. So in any case, the only reason I told that story is because I love Iraj. But there's a sequel to that also, because this is 20 years later, and I'm on the cusp of 85, and life is very different for me now. And I am very sympathetic to particularly older people and the problems that people have, because I am surrounded by peers who are at different stages in their life, and we can laugh among ourselves about how we're failing and so forth, and the things that we're faking and so forth. And but on the other hand, it's difficult because just as my 20-year-old grandson calls his father on the phone regularly, even though he has a cell phone and gets the entire world in his hand, and he can't understand, he couldn't understand, of course, about us having a live-in housekeeper, that we must have been rich. So what our age is, we can't appreciate, and we can't truly relate to anyone of a different age and so forth. It's hard enough, male to female, father to son, mother to son, whatever, that you're talking about. But I'm convinced at this point in my life that it's all relationship, and that whatever else, we are dependent upon one another for those relationships. And through the years, I can't tell you how important this congregation has been to me. And in the Journey group, when we had some difficulties, and I said something to Joe, this goes back a ways, about the fact that we were like a support group. The only support group I ever belonged to was when I was in the PTA, and I was a Garmon, and we had a support group, and I knew that one of the mothers had a child in a mental health hospital, and to this day I would never tell anybody that, but I knew how powerful that was. And for me, that's what our Journey group had become. And when I said that it's like a support group, Joe said that they are all that way. And that's another thing that I must really thank Meredith for, because I didn't even get into the fact that when I was able to retire at age 59, I went to work for a nonprofit that was Zen Buddhist, and I learned about Buddhism to a certain extent, and it was the nonprofit world, and that I worked there for a number of years, and then I gave that up because Norman and I, by that time, had decided to live apart. And we never thought about divorce. At that point, he had an apartment on top because he was a fisherman, a surf caster, and it was a place we loved to go out. And so he decided to live there, and I bought a co-op apartment. And of course, I didn't realize I had to put down a 30% down payment, so he immediately sold all our IBM stock and whatever it was at that time so that I could make this down payment. And a year later, when I had a very serious accident, when I went out from my job at lunchtime, and by that time I was working for a major corporation in this area at that time, but I went out at lunchtime and I was hit broadside, and I had broken, what's the major? Pelvis, thank you, in 2 places, and I had all kinds of breaks and so forth and so on. And Norman came and took care of me for 7 weeks. And when he later developed multiple myeloma, of course, I took care of him. And the night he died at a hospital bed in his apartment, I was on an air mattress on the floor because I was listening. And when he stopped breathing, of course, I woke up immediately because that happens when you're listening for someone. And so we continued to take care of and love one another through our lives. But I never would have been able to do any of the things I was able to do if it hadn't been for this extended family. And that's why those of you who are left here, I thank you for being such a significant part of my life and allowing me to learn so many things like Transgender 101 that we had here, and to even know that in the 1920s, this congregation had voted to have an equal number of women and men on its board, which was something that, well, all these things have changed through the years, but I always fought to keep that in our Constitution here, or our bylaws, simply because I felt that should be memorialized, that the members of this congregation had that kind of vision that they could create that. So I thank you all for your role, and I am so grateful that I am a part of this congregation. Thank you. That was a dream.